With Dr. Michael Scott Cuthbert on Music 21. I'm especially happy to be here because I just found out before this event from Matthias Gruder that actually my grandfather apparently knew Herbert von Karajan and actually appeared in a movie about him. So I'm going to be giving him a call later about that. So I did more of a research project over the last 48 hours rather than a hack, but it kind of still goes into that culture of taking something and really deconstructing it to its core values. So I looked at intervallic relationships in a specific movement of a very famous piece by Messiaen entitled Quartet for the End of Time. So before I launch into what I actually researched, I'm going to give you guys a little excerpt of what it sounds like, and then I'll show you the score. Yeah, great piece, a lot going on there. So when I've listened to this piece many, many times, and I made an observation recently that there seemed to be a consistent intervallic relationship between the first and final notes of most of the measures in the piece. There was no distinct pattern, but there was certain intervallic relationships that occurred a lot more frequently than others. So for example, in these first 6 measures that you just heard, the relationship in the first measure between the first and last notes is an enharmonic major third. The next 4 bars are unisons, and the final bar is a minor third. So the first task that I set out on doing was actually finding out the distributions of intervallic relationships between the first and final notes, and this is what I came up with. So you can see by looking at either the graph or the score that intervallic relationships such as unisons, major seconds, major thirds, augmented fourths occur very, very frequently between the first and final notes of each measure, as opposed to something like a minor seventh at the very end of the spectrum. I think in the final percentage, though, somewhere around 1.6% of the piece. So I have this graph, and I want to say, okay, we can see that there's a huge prevalence of some of these intervals, but is this an intention of Messiaen? Was this an intentional motive to have certain intervals more prevalent than others throughout the piece? So I had organized this code in a specific way to run a certain test, but I needed to see if I got a different outcome by changing the code up a little bit. So what I actually did was do some p-value testing. So in the original code, what I had done was I had done something very simple. I had taken the first note and the last note of each measure and simply compared the intervallic relationship. And what I needed to do to find out whether this was something that was intentional is run a p-value test. And in doing this, I changed it from picking the first and final notes to actually picking 2 random note values within each measure, other than the first and the last ones. So to find the p-value, I had to take some of the most common intervallic relationships and find what this reference percentage would be. In other words, what would all these percentages be added up together? I added together the percentages of unisons, major seconds, minor thirds, major thirds, and this totaled at around 60.67%. Pretty high. And I think, in fact, if you add, what am I forgetting? If you add a minor second in there, it goes somewhere around 65. So in testing the p-value, I changed up this code and I actually ran the test 10,000 times to see if the outcome would exceed this reference percentage of 60.67%. And in running it 1,000 times, only 13 out of those times actually exceeded the reference percentage of 60.67. So you can see p-value equals the number of times this random value exceeded 60.67% divided by the times that we actually ran this code. And as you can see, this equals 0.013%. And I suppose if you're going to get into the more meta subject of what's the purpose of doing this, I think a question that we've all asked at some point is, composers make certain choices, but are they doing this intentionally, or is it just, you know, pure random human error or something like that? So at the end of this project, I concluded that this distribution was, of course, it was not random. It was a very, very intentional thing, and it's something that we can all learn.